My name is Nichole Sheldrick, and in this short lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about rural architecture and settlement in Tripolitania during the Roman and late antique periods. The ancient region of Tripolitania, now covering the northwest part of modern Libya and the south part of modern Tunisia, is very well known for its spectacular Roman period architecture in both city and country. The monuments of the coastal cities of Leptis Magna, Sabratha, and others have captured the attention and imagination of travelers and scholars for centuries, and they're evidence of the rich culture and great wealth of these ancient cities. The architecture and settlement of Tripolitania's countryside are different from that of the cities in many ways, but no less important. The areas of the countryside were very diverse, from the fertile coastal plains and high hills of the Jebel, and into the drier pre-desert and Serdica regions further south with their deeply cut wadis and rocky plateaus. Nevertheless, lavish coastal villas, towering qasur, military forts, and monumental mausolea are striking evidence of large numbers of people not only surviving, but thriving in a difficult environment on the southernmost edges of the Roman Empire. However, most rural buildings are not nearly as impressive. They are of much simpler construction, have little or no decoration, and often survive as a series of low walls or piles of rubble in the countryside. Because of this, they can be difficult or impossible to date without excavation or other forms of evidence. Now, of course, many previous surveys and studies have recorded and discussed to a certain extent the buildings which make up the sites and settlements of rural Tripolitania. One of the most extensive to date, and one which will be familiar to many who work in the region, is the Unesco Libyan Valleys Survey, which took place in the pre-desert, which was carried out by a Libyan-British team in the 1980s, with their synthesis and gazetteer volumes published in 1996, shown on the screen, edited by Graham Barker and David Mattingly, respectively. Other previous investigations have often focused on things like the impact of the Roman army, like Trousset's study of the Limes Tripolitanus in southern Tunisia, or in economic activities, particularly the production of olive oil and wine, like the more recent survey done by Mufta Ahmed in the Jebel Tarhuna. These projects and many others have contributed significantly to our understanding of the Tripolitanian countryside. But nevertheless, few have focused specifically on the rural structures themselves, and so many important questions about the construction, development, and use of rural buildings across Tripolitania remain unanswered or insufficiently addressed. So in this study, which originally formed the basis of my doctoral thesis at the University of Oxford, and which has now been published as a monograph by the Society for Libyan Studies, my goal was to do two main things. The first was to present an updated catalog and synthesis of the existing data on the architecture and construction of rural buildings in Tripolitania during the Roman and late antique periods, that is, from around the 1st century BC until around the 7th century AD. An important aspect of this was, as far as possible, to standardize the data, which came from a huge variety of different surveys and sources, and to create new basic typologies for all of these data. This was so that I could, for the first time, undertake quantitative analyses and meaningful comparisons for the buildings and settlements across the entire region, in a more systematic way and on a wider scale than has previously been possible. The second aim was to use the collected data and analyses to try and answer some questions about the development and use of the rural farm buildings which were constructed and used in Tripolitania during this time. Things like how and why were buildings in different parts of rural Tripolitania similar or different? When and why were certain architectural forms and technologies adopted? And how do we explain some of these differences and changes over time? So in total, in order to conduct this study, I gathered data on over 2,400 structures from rural Tripolitania, and you can see the distribution of these sites on the slide here. As you can see on the map, I divided the material into 9 regions. These regions were based to a certain extent on geographical zones and features such as the Jebel and particular wadi basins, and the extents of previous surveys. But they do also take into account patterns visible in the overall distribution of the recorded material. It should be kept in mind that many of the blank areas on the maps provided are not necessarily indicative of a lack of sites or settlement, therefore, only that those areas have not yet been surveyed or they weren't included in my study due to time or availability of data. On a similar note, since the main focus of this study was the analysis of buildings and architecture, the distribution maps is not necessarily a distribution of known settlement in the region. While it goes without saying, of course, that architecture and settlement are strongly related, my focus was very much on the buildings themselves, and with few exceptions, I only recorded sites for which something could actually be said about the buildings that were present in terms of their size, construction, or other physical characteristics. So this means that any settlements, which were only indicated by scatters of ceramic material, for example, which is sometimes the case in areas of intensive modern agriculture, these types of sites were not included. You'll also notice finally that I divided the buildings into 3 different broad categories: military buildings, unfortified buildings, and fortified buildings. I'm not really going to talk so much today about the military buildings, but we will come back to the unfortified and fortified structures and the reasons for that division shortly. So I began my data collection by recording the sites and information that were available in published sources, and you can see the approximate areas that these surveys originally covered on the map in the white outlines. The bulk of my data collection took place between 2011 and 2015, during which time it was unfortunately not possible for me to visit Libya to conduct fieldwork. So where possible, I located the sites using open access satellite imagery using Google Earth or Bing Maps. This was a really useful exercise because while some of the more recent surveys published coordinates which could be used to find sites, many were conducted before GPS technology was widely available. And so I've now been able to record more accurate locations and to create updated distribution maps for a lot of these sites. In addition, thanks to the high resolution of much of the imagery, I've also been able to add, confirm, and correct where necessary site dimensions and plans for a large number of sites, which for reasons of time and logistics in the original surveys were sometimes only estimated, paced, or are sometimes not even recorded at all. So it was during the course of identifying and mapping the previously published sites using satellite imagery that the scale of the number of sites within and around the published survey areas that had not previously been recorded also became clear. As a result, I decided to conduct a limited amount of new remote satellite imagery survey to augment the existing data set. Sites identified during these remote sensing activities account for approximately 1/3 of the total number of sites in my catalog, and the areas where I undertook new satellite imagery survey are marked on this map in red. For each building, I recorded a number of different quantitative and qualitative characteristics, including things like plan, size, construction techniques, presence of press structures, evidence of decorative features, and many other things. And the catalog of sites, which there's just a screenshot of it shown here, will be available to download online on the Society for Libyan Studies webpage. Now, just a note to say that in order to protect the locations of some of the more vulnerable sites, the coordinates have not been included in the published catalog, but interested students and researchers can contact me directly for some of this information or apply for access to the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa online database, where many of the sites in my catalog have now also been recorded. So, having collected and standardized all of these data, I was then able to start conducting some quantitative and qualitative analyses of the broad categories of structures. As mentioned earlier, I divided the non-military rural buildings I recorded into 2 broad categories: unfortified and fortified farm buildings. Now, unfortified buildings commonly comprised varying combinations of single-storied structures and open spaces bounded by low walls or ranges of rooms, and are sometimes also referred to as open farm buildings, and you can see a reconstruction of one on the left. Fortified buildings, on the other hand, as shown on the right, are characterized by features which have traditionally been interpreted as having a defensive purpose, such as surrounding ditches, high, substantially constructed walls, and single defensible entrances. Now, this distinction is of course not without its problems. First of all, we should not necessarily assume that unfortified sites were not defendable, or that their inhabitants were not concerned with security. For example, we can point to buildings which on the whole can be classified as unfortified, but which have possible watchtowers incorporated into their structures. And conversely, it would be a mistake to assume that all of the apparently defensive features associated with fortified sites were solely the result of a perceived need for protection or security. For example, the single entrances and more inward-facing layouts of many fortified buildings could be related to a greater need for defense, but this form of building has also been shown to offer better protection against the elements, against things like dust storms, and could also be related to a shift in cultural norms, in which privacy became more important, perhaps especially to an elite class who might have wanted to separate themselves physically from others. Nevertheless, while we can point to certain problems with this dichotomy, and it's important to remain cautious and flexible in its application, in general, it is possible to identify some key differences in the morphology and development of so-called unfortified and fortified buildings, which suggests that it remains not entirely inappropriate to maintain this distinction. One other important aspect which suggests these buildings can be divided into separate groups is their dating. Many of the sites in rural Tripolitania have been dated by the surface collection of ceramics. It's important to remember, however, that while ceramic data from surface collection can tell us that a site was probably occupied, or at the very least was the site of some human activity during a particular period, they can usually not tell us anything with certainty about the establishment, construction, development, or abandonment of individual buildings. There have been very few excavations to date at rural buildings in Tripolitania which could give us a better idea or a better understanding of the chronology and life of individual buildings, and this is certainly an area of future research that would be worth pursuing. Nevertheless, based on the evidence of find wares collected during various surveys, as you can see on the charts presented here, in most areas the peak of unfortified settlement was between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, after which the number of unfortified settlements seems to have begun to decline to a greater or lesser extent. In the coastal areas, such as on the island of Jerba to the west, and the areas in the immediate hinterlands of Leptis Magna, which are represented in the charts on the left-hand side, and to some extent also chart number 4, we can see this trend very clearly. However, as we can see in the charts on the right, particularly numbers 5 and 6, at the same time that the number of unfortified sites was declining, around the 3rd to 4th centuries AD, we begin to see a rise in settlements which were based around a fortified structure. And if we just have a look at the map here, we can see in particular that those areas where this shift occurred are in the Jebel, that is the mountainous region to the south and west of Leptis Magna, and the pre-desert region further south. So it's clear that there was a broad chronological difference in the establishment and development of these two building types. Now, it should go without saying that this does not mean that sites of one type or the other were not constructed or occupied outside of these periods, only that the material that we have seems to point to these periods as the most active in terms of their occupants' participation in the wider economy and trade of these particular goods. So if we back up for just a moment, before the 1st century BC, rural settlement in Tripolitania does not really appear to have extended far beyond the immediate hinterlands of the coastal urban centers. Small rural centers at oases and fortified hilltops were scattered across the region, and semi-nomadic pastoralists were utilizing the landscape, but otherwise the majority of the rural areas remained unsettled. However, the relatively sudden appearance of stone buildings across rural Tripolitania around the 1st century AD testifies to a widespread move to sedentary settlement over large parts of the region during this time, probably in part due to a new stability in the region resulting from increasing Roman control. The apparent rapidity and thoroughness with which sedentarization occurred might suggest that there was some common incentive to do so, though there is really no evidence for any kind of deliberate settlement policy. Rather, one possibility is that families or groups that were already successful in the region may have begun to recognize the advantages of participating in larger Roman economic systems. Increasing investment in agriculture while continuing to undertake pastoral activities presented a way for those with large flocks of animals to consolidate and provide more security for their wealth and position, ultimately leading to the emergence of an elite class. So as mentioned previously, from the 1st century AD at the latest, though in some areas as much as a few centuries earlier, the main form of settlement was unfortified or open farm buildings. I further divided the unfortified buildings I recorded in my catalogue into two very broad types. The first was the courtyard building, which I defined specifically as a building with continuous ranges of rooms on at least two sides of an open space, of which you can see some examples here on the screen. Courtyard buildings were found across Tripolitania, and they were demonstrably larger than other types of unfortified buildings, and more often built with construction techniques utilizing ashlar masonry, such as opus africanum, some examples of which are shown on the slide, and they far more often had luxury features such as mosaics or associated bath buildings, and very frequently had presses for olive oil or wine. In the coastal and Jebel regions especially, large, well-built, unfortified courtyard buildings were the norm during the 1st centuries AD, supporting previous studies that have emphasized the significant wealth and prosperity of the coastal and Jebel regions during the first few centuries AD, which was based on agricultural production and processing, particularly of olive oil and wine. Many of these courtyard buildings in the coastal and Jebel regions were potentially the centers of larger estates, which were the property of wealthy landowners who lived in the urban centers. In addition, both the courtyard form itself and the construction technique commonly used in them, opus africanum, can be identified with wider Hellenistic Punic architectural traditions and could be seen as an indication of participation in wider Mediterranean systems. In the pre-desert regions and in Serdica to the east, however, during this same period, the most common building form by far was the farmyard building. These structures were defined by large, open-air enclosed spaces, often with multiple rooms, but not arranged with the same regularity as in courtyard buildings. Features such as decoration and presses were found far less frequently in farmyard buildings than in courtyard buildings. The sizes and construction techniques used in these buildings varied widely, from small structures with 1 or 2 rooms to larger ones with huge enclosures, and they were most often constructed of more or less regularly coursed masonry or rubble. The construction of these buildings and associated irrigation systems for wadi cultivation is clear evidence of a move to sedentary agriculture. But it is important to note that these were not simply smaller or less complex versions of courtyard buildings. Rather, the large open-air enclosed spaces, which were the defining feature of these buildings, were almost certainly intended for corralling animals, and this testified to the continued economic and cultural importance of pastoralism and stock raising alongside agriculture in the lives of the people living in these particular regions. Another difference between the farmyard and courtyard buildings is that the unfortified buildings in both this area, and especially in Serdica, were more often clustered together into small groups or complexes than was the case further north in the coastal and Jebel regions, where the large courtyard buildings tended to be more isolated. This could suggest that different factors contributed to how settlement was organized in the more southern regions, perhaps with families or other social groups opting to live near each other, rather than the kinds of estate system found in the regions closer to the coast. Now, by the time sedentarization and the construction of unfortified buildings was reaching its peak between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, the Roman military had established and was maintaining a presence in the region, which was physically manifested in the imposing military buildings that the soldiers occupied. Strategically located at oases that were probably originally tribal centers and important points in both east-west and north-south trade routes, we can imagine that these buildings would have made a significant impression on the peoples living in the region. So as already mentioned, as early as the 3rd century AD, fortified civilian buildings began gaining popularity in many parts of rural Tripolitania. Undoubtedly, there was a period of overlap, But what little dating evidence we have suggests that during this time, many independent, unfortified buildings were abandoned in favor of fortified buildings and the more closely clustered settlements that frequently surrounded them. These fortified structures, also commonly called gzur, took many forms. In terms of their plan, these were usually, but not always, square or rectangular, with rooms arranged around a small courtyard or light well, and particularly in the Jebel regions, wide surrounding ditches, as shown in the examples on the bottom right. Particularly popular in the pre-desert regions were tower-type buildings, which were 2 or 3 stories in height. They were also characterized by few or small windows and single defensible entrances, and just generally they were quite substantial, imposing structures. However, at the same time, while many of the characteristics and features associated with these buildings had apparently defensive roles, as already briefly mentioned, they could also serve other purposes, which enabled them to continue to be useful and appropriate for the same sorts of agricultural and pastoral activities that had been practiced in association with unfortified buildings. Buildings with the wide ditches just mentioned, especially, for example, the ditches could have acted as reservoirs or gardens, taking advantage of occasional periods of heavy rains. To make up for the apparent loss of outdoor space that was previously provided by large farmyards and courtyards, stock enclosures may have been built as separate structures, or they might have been constructed in more perishable materials that have no longer survived. So, how can we explain the transition between these two very different types of buildings? There are 2 major related factors that we can discuss. A decrease in the stability and security of the regions caused by so-called barbarian raids, and perhaps driven by the former, an increase in the stratification of society. Now, to start with the first point, these barbarian raids are known from historical sources such as Ammianus Marcellinus, who described this situation, in particular the raids of the Austuriani in the 4th century. But we also hear of them directly from epigraphic evidence, and in at least 2 instances, barbarian incursions are cited as the reason for the construction of fortified buildings in the countryside. The earliest, to my knowledge, is the inscription seen on the top left, which is from Ghazar Dwib in the pre-desert, which is actually a military outpost and dates back to the mid-3rd century AD, but specifically mentions these barbarian incursions. A second inscription from Sidi Samez in the Jebel, and probably dating to the 4th century AD, though this one is admittedly poorly dated, also records barbarian incursions, and although the inscription is fragmentary, these again seem to be cited as the reason for the construction of the building. But in this case, it is indeed actually a civilian fortified structure. So there is little reason to doubt that defensibility was a concern which was directly addressed in the construction of these particular building types. The issue of security and defensibility, however, can also be seen in the increasing tendency for people to live in nucleated settlements, which were centered on these fortified buildings. Often, small settlements clearly grew up around the fortified structures. In times of increased insecurity, there is obviously a clear advantage to living in larger groups, near to a central stronghold in which people could, to which people could retreat when there was any immediate threat. Now, these settlements are poorly understood and investigated, and it is difficult to be precise concerning their date. While we can be relatively confident of at least some degree of contemporary occupation when the buildings are physically attached, as in the examples on the right, this is clearly not always the case, as we can see on the examples on the left. However, the fact that these clustered groups of buildings and enclosures were often rather haphazardly arranged suggests that in many cases they developed gradually over years, or even decades, as families and settlements grew. This might support the idea of a process whereby people gradually abandoned their unfortified farms and moved closer to fortified farm buildings rather than this happening all at once. One possible consequence of this increased instability in the region was what appears to be a drastic reduction in olive presses. Here we have the distribution of presses recorded at unfortified buildings. And then if we switch over here on this slide at the presses recorded at fortified buildings. The comparative dearth of presses at fortified buildings compared to unfortified ones would appear to suggest that overall there was a decline in olive oil and or wine production sites in the centuries following the rise in popularity of fortified buildings. Now, one possible reason for this is that greater insecurity in the region during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD might have prompted people to reduce their reliance on olives as their main crop, because they required long-term investment. The trees took years to mature, and so if anything happened to them, it could take quite a long time to recover. Instead, it's possible that annual crops became more important. This pattern is also consistent with the decline of the coastal cities to which the farms in the coastal and Jebel regions were probably connected. Also of note is that in Serdica, after the 3rd to 4th centuries AD in this area to the east, there was widespread, if not total, abandonment of sedentary rural settlement, suggesting that whatever agricultural or pastoral economy had been established there in the first 3 centuries AD was no longer worth pursuing. This move can perhaps even be seen as a conscious rejection of sedentary settlement in favor of a semi-nomadic pastoralism. In the pre-desert regions, however, permanent settlement clearly remained the norm, and the construction of substantial fortified buildings in these regions indicate a certain level of continued prosperity, which brings us to the second point that is commonly cited for the shift of fortified structures, which is an increasing stratification of society. In general, as already mentioned, it appears that agricultural and pastoral activities continued in the pre-desert and Jebel regions in much the same way as they had when unfortified buildings were more common, even if in some cases, perhaps on a smaller scale. However, the forms and arrangements of the fortified buildings and their settlements indicate that these activities were now probably far more frequently based around estates, conspicuously centered on these elite structures. The construction of impressive, well-built fortified towers and compounds, often with decorative embellishments and large, presumably dependent settlements, is indicative of a society in which a select group of people had both the means and the desire to advertise their wealth, as well as the status and power that came with it. This is especially striking because this kind of decoration, the kind that we see on the screen, was far less common on domestic unfortified buildings in the same regions, and I don't know of a single unfortified domestic building in Tripolitania which had an inscription, even ones for which we have other evidence that the occupants may have had a certain amount of wealth or status, based on other evidence of luxury, such as the presence of mosaics or marble. In earlier periods, these kinds of decorations or inscriptions were essentially confined to funerary structures. So this seems to indicate some kind of shift in the desire for the wealthy to display wealth and status in domestic contexts, emphasizing the power and status of the living, not just the dead. All of these things appear to point to the existence of a prospering local elite who were building and inhabiting these fortified structures. The substantiality and height of fortified tower buildings especially made them an ideal means by which to convey this message in a far more emphatic way than had been the case with the unfortified buildings, and the contrast between these new buildings and those that already existed in the landscape would have been striking. These fortified buildings were often sited in more defensible, but also therefore more visible and commanding locations in the landscape, on hilltops, cliffs, or spurs overlooking the wadis, whereas their unfortified counterparts were often located directly on the slopes or edges of the wadis. In many cases, as in the examples seen here on the slide, the fortified farms were built in very close proximity to the older unfortified ones, and we can suspect that it was even the same families or groups inhabiting them, but that they have deliberately sited their new structure in a more prominent location. It would have been very clear to everyone that viewed these buildings that their construction and maintenance were only achievable by a select group of wealthy and powerful people. Their prominence in the landscape would have drawn attention to them, unmissable, constant reminders of the power and resources available to the elite. Their similarity to Roman military architecture may also have led people to view them as symbols of military power, authority, and legitimacy. So by the 5th and 6th centuries AD, it seems likely that whatever stability had been provided by the integration of the region into the Roman Empire, which had made the widespread sedentarization of the 1st century AD possible, was again on the wane. Many of the permanent settlements established in the first 4 centuries AD began to be abandoned, and it's possible that outside the coastal regions, many people probably returned to the socio-economic systems of semi-nomadic pastoralism that their ancestors had previously practiced, and indigenous leaders and groups once again gained control over the interior. While agriculture and permanent settlement certainly continued into the Islamic period and beyond, it was probably not on the same scale as previously, especially in the pre-desert regions. While the evidence proves that settled agriculture was certainly possible in the pre-desert regions especially, it required substantially more work to maintain it, more than in the more fertile areas in the Jebel and along the coast. And it's possible that without the incentive and support of being part of wider Mediterranean economic systems, it was no longer worth investing in this form of production and subsistence. So this has just been a very brief overview and introduction to the rural buildings and architecture of Tripolitania's countryside during the Roman and late antique periods. If you are interested in learning more about this topic and for a more in-depth explanation of the analyses I conducted, as previously mentioned, this work is now being published as a monograph by the Society for Libyan Studies, with a digital version available open access through the Society's website. And I would just like to take this opportunity now, before I wrap up, to extend my thanks to the Society for Libyan Studies, and especially Victoria Leach, for sponsoring the publication of this book. I really am very grateful and honored to have this work published with the Society, and this is something that I really would have had a very hard time believing would ever happen when I originally joined the Society as a master's student some 15 years ago. And just before I conclude, I have a few further thanks to make. As I mentioned at the beginning, this study was the focus of my doctoral work at the University of Oxford, and I would just like to acknowledge my supervisor, Andrew Wilson, who gave me a great deal of valuable advice and guidance during that time when the bulk of this work was undertaken, as well as David Mattingly, Janet Delane, Bruce Hitchner, and Martin Sterry, all of whom, either during my doctorate or during the publication process of the more recent monograph, all these people read all or substantial parts of the manuscript and offered me many suggestions and helpful tips, and I'm really very grateful to all of them. Many of the images in this presentation are from the original UNESCO Libyan Valleys Survey Archive, which is housed by the University of Leicester, and I'm very grateful to both them and the Society for allowing me to consult and use these images. So thank you very much for watching.